me to pretend that I'm still 19 and I'm still angry and I'm still around the same things that I was around at 19 is a bit fake. But at the same time, you got to find a fine balance, because the older you get, the more you learn, you can end up becoming a hypocrite and sounding like you don't understand the mentality that you even had yourself. And I think that's a thing that I wrestle with in my lyrics, wanting to spread a positive message, but also trying to not act like I don't really understand a negative mentality, when I used to have a very negative mentality myself. And that's, you have to be careful not to sound like you're trying to tell people what to do. I would say to the youth of today, just believe in yourself. You know, you've got a lot of people out there telling young people, particularly working class young people, that they're shit, to be frank. And I don't really understand a society that wants to talk to its young people that way and demonize its young people in that way. Is a very unwell society, in my opinion. And so I would say to young people, all you've got is each other. You know, because a lot of the older generation are too scared of you to even bother to want to talk to you. And I'm sort of in between. I'm not old and I'm not young. I'm not teenage young, but I'm still a young person, you know. And I would say take care of each other, man. Inspire one another, and realize that if you're not looking out for one another, no one else is clearly going to do that. Some of the older people are going to help you, but for the most part, there's always that generational gap, especially in a society driven by materialism and driven by many of the other things we have here. And I would just say that, I don't know, don't believe the bullshit. You know, there's a lot of people selling you nonsense that they gain from. But what I mean by that, for example, is like, who gains from you going to jail? For example, we're sold the idea that going to jail, particularly if you're, if you're a young black boy, especially, going to jail like defines your masculinity. You know what I mean? If you're in jail, you're not a real you. You know what I mean? Well, you got to look at who owns all the prisons that you go to. Does anyone in your community own them? Who along that whole process of you going to jail, who gets paid? So you get arrested, right? So let's say there's a violent incident happens. Forensics come to the scene. Police come to the scene. An ambulance comes to the scene. Someone gets arrested. That person gets arrested, gets held in jail. There's a jailer who's on a salary. There's a person who books you into the police station who's on a salary. Then you go to court. You get a lawyer. The lawyer's on a salary. The judge is on a salary. By the time you go to jail, millions of pounds have been spent on you, one, processing guy in jail. So imagine we spent that money as a society on creating jobs for young people rather than creating more prison places for young people. But we don't want to do that. So if we don't want to do that, young people have to have the smarts to ask why.
I think it's quite interesting the way that racism has become almost like a dirty word, right? 50, 60 years ago, people weren't really ashamed to be racist. It was considered an acceptable part of the culture. People didn't have to apologise. The racism was very overt and very unapologetic. What happened was, because of people's resistance to that racism, it's become, people feel insulted by being called a racist. Even if they are definitely racist, even if their actions are definitely racist, even if their behaviour is very racist, people feel that you're insulting them. So there's this denial culture that exists today. And even if it's painfully obvious, I mean, we live in a country set up with an imperialistic, racist history, and that's infected the economies and institutions of the country, from the police through to jobs, through to education. And why wouldn't it affect the music industry? I mean, of course it will. And so you have a situation where you can have, as what you touched on, young white rappers from predominantly African Caribbean areas making videos, creating pornography of black males killing each other, referring to these people as hungry apes living in jungles. And if you're not comfortable with that as a black person, right? Given that my father used to have bananas thrown at him just 20 years ago, given that, the first black player to play for England was having bananas thrown at him just 20 years. We're not talking about ancient history here, right? And if we are going to go back a little further than that, it was being argued that black people were indeed not even human. In fact, they were more closely related to monkeys and apes. So it's not a very subtle metaphor. If you take issue with that, people who claim to love hip-hop say you've got a chip on your shoulder. Not that what was happening was maybe a bit out of order. And this is just one manifestation of many of the ways in which even people that claim to love music that comes out of an African Caribbean experience don't love and respect the people that are producing it. But this is not new. During segregation, people would go to jazz gigs or blues gigs when the only black person allowed in the venue was the black person on stage, right? And so the music industry has evolved in step with American society, because the music industry is predominantly controlled by the United States. And American society still is, it doesn't matter what colour the person in the White House is, it's a fundamentally at its ground level is set up as a racist society. So I don't say these things to be mean or to even complain. But I think it's important that artists, if you're getting in the industry and you look a particular way, right? Let's say you're overweight, for example. You got to understand that the music industry has a particular image that it wants to promote. It doesn't want to promote people of a particular weight, generally. It wants to promote one image of beauty. If you're overweight, you got to understand that, right? Or if you're a person of colour getting into the music industry, you got to understand that there's certain stereotypes that the music industry wants to promote. If you're not aware of that, and you think you're going to come into the music industry not promoting those stereotypes and get promoted in the same way, you're going to come up against resistance. So I don't analyse these things to be horrible. I analyse them so young artists coming into the game can understand what barriers are in place.
I would say my music is social commentary. You know, it continues in the traditions of, I suppose, African oral poets right through jazz and blues, up to Gil Scott-Heron, through Public Enemy, through Caribbean reggae and dancehall music, trying to fuse all of that I've grown up listening to and being aware of my role as an oral poet, as hopefully a historian to some degree. So I would say certainly oral social commentary. The political message has changed from being one that, with your John Lennons and your Jimi Hendrixes and your Bob Marleys, was questioning the dominant agenda. I would say music today, even mainstream music, is equally political. It's just that it's pushing a dominant agenda, and that's what I think we never really make the distinction with. We say music's lost its politics. It hasn't. Music that's, for example, encouraging young African-American or African-Caribbean males here to go to jail in a society where prison is private business, both as it is in the United States and as it is becoming increasingly here, in a country that has the kind of history that the United States has and that Britain has in relation to those populations, is obviously political. And so that's what I think we've lost track of, is that the music is still political. It's just the agenda that we're hearing more and more, the agenda that it's pushing is increasingly capitalist, increasingly sexist, increasingly misogynistic, increasingly racist, essentially, or fulfilling particular racial stereotypes. So that politics is still there. It's just that there isn't an alternative to the dominant agenda. The only politics we're now hearing, for the most part in the mainstream, is the dominant political agenda. Obviously, there's a dominant agenda set, and in the sense that once 2 or 3 artists become tremendously successful in a particular paradigm, a whole group, or pushing a particular paradigm, a whole generation of young people start to push that. So when Bob Marley became the big I am in the 70s, you know, a whole generation of young people in Britain turned Rastafarian. You know, you even had white English kids that were Rastafarians here. It wasn't just an African-Caribbean thing, though. That's where he was most strongly represented. His impact was across the board. Now, whoever the superstar is of a particular time, or whatever the superstars are representing, is where people move towards. So all it takes is for 2 or 3 people to become superstars, pushing a particular agenda, talking about a particular thing, and then a whole generation of young people think, well, the only way to be successful is to do that. And so they push towards that. And so it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. People say political music doesn't sell, but then, or music questioning the dominant politics doesn't sell, but then it's not on the radio. So how would you know whether it's going to sell or not going to sell? Because Public Enemy sold perfectly fine. Bob Marley sold hundreds of millions of records. You know, Stevie Wonder sold. You know, we can look right through the history of music and see artists that did question particular things, selling millions and millions of records. So it's kind of a lame excuse when they say it doesn't sell, because it's not being pushed anymore. So of course it's not going to sell the same numbers that it used to sell. The music being so overtly, particularly with current, not even just mainstream hip-hop actually, just mainstream music, being so misogynistic, reflecting the misogyny of our societies, and of course with the racial stereotypes, overwhelmingly the audience or the people buying the records are not African Caribbean or African American, again reflects kind of a legacy we haven't dealt with of a need to kind of stereotype the other. Because ultimately myself, as someone whose father is Jamaican, whose mother is Scottish, if I spoke about one side of my ancestry, i.e. the white Scottish side, with the level of disrespect that has become normalised for people to speak about the other side of my ancestry, I'm pretty sure everyone, even young black kids here, would say Akala's gone crazy. I wouldn't say the political rap scene's moved here. There's still a scene underground in the US, and even though artists like myself and Low Key and others, like there's a young man called Jaja Soz, a guy called Swiss, Logic, there's a whole scene here of young politically driven hip hop artists, and they certainly do all have a fan base and are all creating careers for ourselves, but at the same time we're not on daytime radio 10 times a day. So there is still that battle being had versus the amount of popularity artists have, not equating to the amount of representation they get on radio and in media.
Identifying to be free is kind of like that. I think every so often you have to remind people who you are, where you come from, what you're about. I might be trying to express myself as widely as possible as an artist, but I'm from a particular environment, I'm from a particular background, and as an MC, I came out of a very braggadocio, arrogant, aggressive tradition. I don't apologize for that. That's hip hop. Arrogance is the wrong word, but arrogance is the word. But like rappers were like superheroes to me growing up. Like Wu-Tang were like Spider-Man and Superman. They had their superpowers, like, and that's what made hip hop great for me. I think a lot of these kind of, I don't know what the word is, but there's some hip hop supporters that don't really get that, and they get put off by what they see as arrogance. To me, I love that. One of my big issues with conscious rappers when I was growing up is they didn't have the aggression and the persona that DMX had. You know what I mean? The only conscious MCs for me growing up that really, or so-called conscious MCs that brought me in, like Wu-Tang, Immortal Technique, and Dead Prez, was for me because they had that same aggression and that same show-off braggadocio persona, but they applied it to being smart. And that's what I found attractive. And so that's what I've tried to do. No one wants to listen to the guy who they think is a bit nerdy. I'm not saying it to be horrible. You can be a nerd without being nerdy, do you know what I mean? And I think the reason why knowledge is power, and a lot of, whether we want to admit it or not, a lot of the things that I say have resonated with people, particularly young boys from similar backgrounds to mine, is because they still see themselves in me, if I'm honest. I was quite good at football, but I don't think I would have been, I think I could have been a professional football player. And I'm not saying it to be arrogant. I think most people that played with me would say, yeah, you know what, I've bumped into guys who've made it, who were my year group, who've been like, oh, brother, I really thought you was going to make it. But I was in football in the wrong period of my life as well. In a period of my life where I wasn't very disciplined, where I started thinking I was a rude boy, where I was getting involved in stuff I shouldn't have been involved in. I didn't have that discipline. I think if I'd have had that family structure, you know, if my dad was constantly there, or I had an uncle who used to play football, which a lot of the boys I saw who made it, even the ones from the hood, had this kind of structure. I'm not blaming it on that. But I just got to an age where I didn't love football enough to be able to self-motivate. And whereas I did love music enough to be able to self-motivate, to take the time to write my songs. I haven't played a competitive game of football in 10 years. That shows you I didn't really love football in the way that I love music. I couldn't go 10 years without writing a song. But sometimes I miss it, but not on a professional level, just on a down the park having fun kind of level. Again, I feel very lucky, like I was exposed to a lot of things that gave me this fire and gave me this passion. But I believe in spirit, you know, I don't believe in organised religion, but I believe there is a spirit, an intelligent force that manifests everything we see before us. I mean, we now know this table is mostly hollow. It's mostly empty space, yet it has the appearance of being solid. We have these illusions, you know, we know that from a microscopic cell, smaller than that gap in my finger, you know, me, you, everyone in the world used to be that. You know, that's magic to me. Like, we talk about magic, but that's magic. And so I think to a certain degree, your life experiences can enhance this feeling within you that I call spirit, or crush it. And I've been lucky enough that my life experiences, even if some of them have not been what you'd call positive, have pushed me in that direction where I feel connected to something beyond my personal flesh. But I don't want to call it God, because, you know, God is a strange, well, it's a culturally specific word for a start. But there's something, and I don't know what it is. And I think that physics and spirituality both really, at their best, say the same thing. But when we deal with histories of race, racism, colonialism, neo-colonialism, white supremacy, classism, capitalism, all of these isms in the world, we usually tend to, if we dialogue about them at all, think of them in plain economic terms often, you know, or in plain political terms. What we rarely look at is psychological motivations, let alone psychosexual motivations, or how these mind states, how things other than logical material motive motivate behaviors towards different groups of people, if that makes sense, right? There is a logic to certain kinds of oppression in that there are very real gains from those kind of things, but there is no logic, at least to my mind, to things like serial killers, or to, I don't know, hacking someone up and throwing them in a fridge, right? There are certain strange human behaviors that exist as extreme as that, or as mundane as the day-to-day, and one of them I want to look at today is the intersection of sex and race, particularly between men, particularly between black and white men. And this relationship, or this obsession in some ways, this historical obsession around black masculinity and black virility and black male sexual power. But a video that was screened just before the 200 meters final on the BBC, and it was basically a eugenics video, as you're going to see.
essentially suggesting the reason why a few tiny percentage of the black men on the earth can run very fast is because they were bred to run fast during slavery, which is very interesting. I'm going to break down why it's complete pseudoscientific nonsense, but then I'm going to look at what it means about the culture and what it says further than that. In fact, kind of disgracefully, in my opinion, Michael Johnson, who's obviously very ignorant of his own history, was then hired by Channel 4 to do another whole hour-long documentary looking at this supposed relationship between slavery and, like I said, 80 black men of the 600 million black men on earth have run the 100 meters in under 10 seconds, 80, so it's not exactly representative of all of our athletic abilities, but apparently there's some relationship, and even Michael Johnson subscribes to that silly idea. Subscribes to this myth of the breeding of the super slave, which even many people in the island, my grandmother comes from in Jamaica, actually believe in this crap, that in Jamaica the most rebellious Africans were dropped off and were bred in a particular way. Let's explain something very basic. 10 times the amount of Africans were taken to Brazil as were taken to the United States of America. In fact, historians estimate as many Africans were taken to Brazil as the rest of the Americas combined. Today, there are 85 million people that self-identify as black in Brazil. And if you know anything about Brazilian society, you know that that means there's a whole lot more people that you would think of as black that do not identify as so. So it means there are at least 40 times as many black people in Brazil as there is in Jamaica. Slavery went on more than half a century longer in Brazil than it did in Jamaica, yet Brazil produces no sprinters. It doesn't take a genius to figure out why. Sprinting is not culturally rewarded in Brazil. It's not popular. Nobody does it. Football, the sport that is, as you know, Brazilians are quite good at. In Jamaica, the youth, so if you're a school child, the school athletics meet fills the national stadium. So it's not difficult, again, to figure out why that is rewarded. And then in terms of the insulting idea that centuries of malnourishment and mistreatment can improve a person's genetics, of course, to anyone with a GCSE level knowledge of biology, it becomes completely ridiculous. But even to be specific, if you've grown up in an African Caribbean community, even in this country, everyone who lives in Brixton or Peckham or Tottenham or anywhere else knows, visibly, the biggest, strongest kid in the class was always the Ghanaian or the Nigerian kid. It was never the Jamaican kid. So there's very real evidence, even if you were to look at, if you go to when I first travelled to West Africa, you can visibly see the greater physical stature of men in West Africa than, say, in the Caribbean. And that would logically follow, like I said, that centuries of malnourishment and mistreatment in that way would actually retard rather than improve your genetics. The fact that despite that, people in the Caribbean and other places are still strong is a testament to their humanity, not a testament to the great sideways gift of benevolent slave masters. Because I knew even at 10 it was insane. This man, presumably, must have had the same penis for his entire career, right? He didn't suddenly develop a new penis the day he won an Olympic gold medal. Yet, at no other point in his career was what was in Linford's trousers an issue. The moment he wins the Olympic gold medal, the next day, just to remind Linford Christie, in case he thought for a moment that winning a gold medal on behalf of this country and wrapping himself in the Union Jack made him a citizen of the country, he was reminded by the entire national media that all he was a big, long, walking black penis. Right? And I remember seeing there was a hosepipe ban the same year. And I remember a little cartoon had Linford Christie walking up to the hosepipe band man, and the hosepipe band man pointing at his trousers telling him there was a hosepipe ban, right? That's how ridiculous it got. Linford went on a question of sport with Jimmy Greaves, and he started crying. And this really, to me, when we talk about masculinity, it was profound that kind of a flabby, not very strong, not necessarily stereotypically virile man like Jimmy Greaves could reduce Linford Christie to tears. But by projecting his own insecurities onto Linford Christie. For those who didn't see it, they were having a conversation. Linford, quite rightly, was a little bit pissed off about the fact that he just won an Olympic gold medal and all anyone could talk about was what was in his trousers. And Jimmy Greaves thought it was a big joke. And Linford started crying. And I think that was actually quite beautiful. The reason why I say that is because particularly as African Caribbean men, this is what I've been saying to people all weekend, we tend to think of racism as this thing out there that white people do that everyone else is passive victims of, which may be flattering to racist people's egos, but just isn't reality. There are plenty of black and brown people who internalise the idea that white people are superior in various different ways. There are some even who love that idea because it gives them power, right? If I can be attached to power, whatever colour that power is, throughout the history of all kinds of imperialism, people will do that. So lots of people find it difficult to express themselves within that and even internalise and then project. Rap music being one of the main ways in which black men project this kind of fake, super, hyper masculinity, right, that we know is not real. Black men in America don't control the country. They don't make the guns. They don't have the biggest weapons in America. They're not the most violent part of American society. They may commit a lot of murders within America. They're not colonizing the rest of the world. But what rap does, and what other projections of the image of black men within Western culture does, it kind of creates a deal, in my view, where men from impoverished African-American neighborhoods, right, that know they don't really run the country, that don't really have the power, can project themselves as the biggest, baddest guy in the country. And the people who actually make the guns that they're killing each other with, right, who created the neighborhoods that they live in, that's not to excuse people's personal responsibility, can say, look, here's the gangsters. We can have, every year, hundreds and hundreds of Hollywood films with Bruce Willis, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, or whoever else, with their gun on it. At no point does anyone say, what is wrong with white men and their obsession with guns, right? But one rapper, which is really the only one I know of in modern history, poses with a gun on the cover of his rap CD, and apparently all black men have an obsession with guns, which is very interesting. And so it's for me, even around rap music, the dialogue around what it says, A, about how black men feel about one another, that we think is entertaining to listen to music that sounds like it could easily have been made by the Ku Klux Klan, right, some of this music, if you think about what's being said. But it also says a lot about the wider culture, that you can sell 10, 11, 12, 15 million records to young middle-class white kids in suburbia saying, die nigga die, shoot nigga shoot, kill nigga kill, right? And as I always say to people, say to young black boys when I work with them and they write these lyrics, I'm not going to cuss you, I used to write that kind of nonsense, right? I grew up listening to Mobb Deep and thought it was quite cool, right? But I said to them, okay, let's look at it like this. My mum's white, my dad's black, right? If I start writing lyrics saying, let's kill Whitey, let's go kill some honkies, what do you think the reaction would be? And without exception, every single young black boy I've said this to, even the ones that write these kind of lyrics, I'm going to kill some niggas when I see them, every single one says, no, you can't do that, that's racist. Every single one without exception. I've done it in prison, I've done it in schools, I've done it in loads of... So what does it say about what they believe about the value of white life versus their own life? And I would say the interaction between sex and violence, and sex as violence. Men tend to imagine, in many ways, sex as violence. This is our gun, our tool. The fact that it's the most sensitive organ that any human has, male or female, seems to escape men, or maybe it's because it's such a sensitive organ that we pretend it has so much power. A woman's sexual organ is muscle, a man's sexual organ is not. Who really has the sexual power? I think all men that have ever had sex with women know who really has the power. And I think to reflect, and in closing, that sort of image for me of seeing Linford Christie crying that way, on the one hand felt very embarrassing, made me very angry, it was very oppressive, but it was also very beautiful that a man that could clearly snap Jimmy Greaves' neck in a split second if he wanted to, was comfortable enough in his own self to say, I'm so disgusted, not complimented, because this is the issue, right? Hypermasculinity and this idea of being sexual predators and dominant and whatever is also kind of attractive. So for a lot of young African Caribbean men, even if they don't feel that way, even if they're not particularly physically strong, even if they don't have the capacity to do violence, because that is seen as attractive, that is seen as the way to be. Or as my friend Jaja Sows said, when he was 15, he believed he wasn't a real black boy if he didn't go to prison. That was his self-concept, and he did, as a self-fulfilling prophecy, go to prison. Now, if he lived in Nigeria or Ghana or anywhere else, he wouldn't have believed that was part of his identity. That doesn't mean there are not criminals in those places. It means that when I go to Ghana and Nigeria, I see black men walking down the street holding hands, and it's weird to me, because we're not capable of showing that kind of love in this kind of society. So I think that having more platforms for open discussion about the more perverse aspects of things like racism is discomforting for a lot of people, is difficult. But I think there are deeper insecurities and issues and motivations behind a lot of these behaviours that we don't like to talk about, but if we're ever going to unpick and defeat, and I think this applies to sexism as well, to reflect on that last point I was saying, I think the very real and obvious greater sexual power that women actually do have in relation to men, I believe and I've learnt from the Taoist, actually Chinese tradition, that part of men's frustration is this obvious difference in power. And we try to compensate for that in various different ways. In the Chinese Taoist tradition, what they actually teach men to do is to do something, I was talking to Julie about this other day, is to injaculate. So they actually teach men a system by where men learn to orgasm without ejaculating any fluid. It sounds strange, but I know people that practice it, so I know that it does actually happen. And it does a number of things. It means men don't constantly expel life force from their body. And he argues that because it evens in some way the relative power imbalance between men and women in the bedroom, that he thinks that would go some way to curing something. Now, I'm not saying he's right or wrong. What I'm saying is, in other parts of the world, there are conversations being had around sex, around these kinds of taboos that I think we could learn from. That we don't have ever in public, I don't think, a mature discussion about what is even good sex or bad sex, right? There's pornography everywhere in the world. You can see sex more than you can ever see it before, but we can't talk, even in sex education in school. Imagine young boys are never taught, don't do that. That porno you watch, not good. You know, no one ever talks to people maturely, which, like I said, there are other systems in other places that do, about what makes good and bad sex. And if we did more, I think that a lot of these insecurities would be removed, a lot of the mythologies would be removed that imprison the people that create the mythologies and the people that are on the receiving end of those mythologies. So I think it's just important for us to have these discussions on a bigger, broader level without fear of offending anyone, because if we believe in democracy, and that's what democracy is about, is having even the most uncomfortable discussions.